Hi, I'm Mike Knetter. Welcome to the UW Now Livestream, where we bring you experts from the Wisconsin community talking about timely and important topics. And it's December, so we thought we should have an episode on predictions. Everybody's making theirs, so what do our experts think? It's been another tumultuous year, and everyone's kind of wondering what's coming next. Is the Fed going to be able to beat back inflation without causing a recession? Well, we've got someone to talk about that. Will 2024 bring a Biden-Trump rematch, or will other candidates emerge during the coming year? How might geopolitical events and international alliances evolve in the wake of tensions between the West, Russia, and China? More recently, I wonder if the autocrats in Russia, China, and Iran have overplayed their hand a bit. And then finally tonight, we're going to get a mathematician's take on predictions in general. What are expert predictions really based on, and how reliable are they? So we've got 4 UW experts with us this evening, and they're going to give us some thoughts about 2023 and beyond. Jordan Ellenberg is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Mathematics and the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of Mathematics. Jordan, thanks for being here tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Jon Pevehouse is the Chair of the Department of Political Science and the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science. Eleanor Powell is the Booth Fowler Associate Professor of Political Science. And finally, joining us tonight is Brad Tank, who will be kicking us off. And those of you who watch the program have seen Brad talk about finance and economics countless times now. So thank you all for being here tonight. This promises to be a fun segment, and I look forward to hearing our audience questions, and maybe you all have a few questions for each other when we're done too. So let me tell you a little bit more about Brad's background. Expert on macroeconomics and monetary policy. He's always been one of my favorite Fed watchers. He's the chief investment officer and a managing director at Neuberger Berman, a global firm with over $400 billion in assets under management. He has 38 years of industry experience in a variety of executive leadership positions and mutual fund management. And he is a graduate of the vaunted Applied Securities Analysis program at the Wisconsin School of Business, where he studied under the watchful eye of Steve Hawk and had a lot of great classmates. So, Brad, you take it away. Tell us what you see on the horizon and whether the Fed can beat back inflation without causing a recession.
Will do, and thank you, Mike. We will we'll go back to something that you and I covered in this session early in the year, which is inflation. Mike and I were together very beginning of this year, January, February, joined by 2 economists from the University of Wisconsin, and we talked about inflation, which was beginning to become a problem. And of course, it accelerated as we went into spring and didn't peak here in the United States until the beginning of summer in June. And if you're paying close attention to these things, we got another inflation report today. It was better than expected and a little bit better than last month, but still running very, very high. Today's number was a 7.1% annual rate year on year. And when Mike and I were together at the beginning of the year, our prediction for 2022, one of our 10, at Neuberger Berman, we do a look ahead every year about this time. We publish a research piece called Solving For. We just published Solving for 2023, and a number of our themes were recurring. Recurring from 2022 theme is that inflation will continue to run hot and be around for a while. And a year ago, we were a bit of an outlier with that forecast. Today, it's become more of a mainstream forecast, although there are opinions that are all over the place. But we have a lot of conviction that the strange period that followed the global financial crisis, which was marked by an absence of price inflation and near zero interest rates, policy rates as engineered by central banks around the world, we're leaving it in the rearview mirror and return to more conventional economic circumstances, much like the late 90s, the early part of the 2000s. We don't think that the current inflation, which peaked north of 9% in June, is a hearkening back to the 70s, which some of us can remember, and has been cited as a possible analogy. We don't think that, but we do think inflation is going to hang around for a while. What does that mean in terms of predictions for 2023? We saw a little bit north of 7% today. We think it will still be north of 4% in middle of 23, and still north of 3% at the end of year end. All far from the central bank's target of 2% inflation, which they worked really hard to get there for a dozen years, and they went right through it, and now are working hard to rein it in. So to answer your question, Mike, the Fed will be successful at containing inflation. Inflation's headed lower. When do we get to 2%? It's probably a 2024 event. Plenty can happen between now and then, but they ultimately will contain it. I'll get to the second part of your equation or question, which is, can they do it without a recession? I'll get to that in a minute. I want to spend just a couple of more minutes on inflation and then growth in general before we get to the recession question. So why do we think inflation is going to persist and be stickier than it has over the last 12 or 13 years? And it's a function of some things that were happening during the pandemic that were much longer term in nature. To some extent, were cloaked by the pandemic. What we would describe as long-term inflection point or regime change. And a big part of it is global demographics, aging labor forces. It's true here in the US. We're all aware of the large number of baby boomers. If you're one, you may have retired already. If you haven't, you've probably got it on the horizon. But probably the most important global demographic is the rapid aging of the Chinese workforce. The factory to the world, the lowest cost manufacturer, no longer the case. And that economy is undergoing some pretty massive changes. And there's no big number two yet willing to fill that space in terms of really providing a vast reservoir of low price global labor. And there's other things at work too. To some extent, we're going through a period of deglobalization, and I'll come back to that in a moment. So global demographics are a big deal. The other thing that's a big deal that means prices higher longer is green energy transition. It's gotten a lot of attention this year. We came into the year with a little bit of attention focused on green energy transition. With the unfortunate events of Eastern Europe, Ukraine, some of those shortages and disruptions that have occurred as a result of that, the green energy transition, which is going to be with us for a long, long time, basically means that barring technological breakthroughs, and there will be some along the way, clearly, the cost of energy, when you consider all energy inputs, both carbon and non-carbon, is done going down, and in all likelihood will go up. That is a big deal because post-industrialization, late 1800s, one constant factor in the global economy is the cost of energy inputs have relentlessly gone down. That's over. And the transition to less carbon is going to be expensive, and it's going to take some time. A subset of that is a focus on security and reshoring. And reshoring is happening. We read about the big chip plants getting built in Arizona and Ohio. And that's an expensive proposition. I was in Ohio 2 weeks ago seeing clients in Columbus. And one of my clients told me that the build out of the Intel chip plant is going to require 1,000 licensed electricians. He also pointed out there's just 16,000 licensed electricians in Ohio. So already the wage rates of electricians in Ohio is going up, even though they really haven't started this project. And these are big dollar infrastructure projects, and there's going to be a lot more of them. We're just at the beginning of this. And then lastly, the central banks are a bit conflicted with policies. We saw it most recently in the UK, where they had to reverse course to support their bond market, support their currency. And post global financial crisis, most central banks around the world have mandates beyond fighting inflation. And maintaining liquid and orderly markets is a big one that at times may bias policy toward easy money and inflation. So those are the reasons we've been on this inflation theme for a while. So far, It hasn't had a huge adverse effect on the U.S. economy. The impact in other parts of the world, of course, has been in some cases worse and in some cases dramatically worse. Europe, much worse. Certain parts of the developing world, much worse. But the fact that we had very high inflation throughout most of 2022, yet maintained positive growth and low unemployment is pretty remarkable. Very resilient economy. As we go into 2023, we think growth is going to wane. Now, there are forecasts. According to Bloomberg, this is the most widely forecast recession that has been measured. 2/3 of forecasters that they survey, economic forecasters, are forecasting a recession next year. It's probably a good bet that we get it. The tricky thing about recessions is you don't really know that you've had one until it's over, or at least you're in the middle of it. We had 2 quarters of no growth in the U.S. in the first half of this year, yet it didn't feel that bad. And this is a key point. Whatever the circumstances and degree of the slowdown that occurs next year, it probably won't feel that bad because nominal growth is coming down from some very high levels, and real growth is the convention that most economists use to measure recession or no recession. And this makes this slowdown very uncharacteristic of what we've gotten used to over the last 20 years or so. So think about the first half of 2022. Nominal growth was very strong, high single digits. Real growth was non-existent. The difference is inflation. And the slowdown that will characterize the U.S. economy next year will look similar, not as dramatic. Inflation will be coming down. Growth may stall, approach zero, maybe even turn negative in real terms. But nominal growth surely will remain positive. And that's an important setup for the next prediction, which relates to markets. How are markets going to do next year? I think it's safe to say that, barring some global catastrophe that pushes prices higher, yet again, inflation peaked in the U.S. in June, north of 9%. It's likely that long-term interest rates, as measured by the U.S. 30-year, the U.S. 10-year, peaked just a few weeks ago. The U.S. 10-year got to 4.35. It's around 3.5% today. That may have been for this cycle the high water mark. If you follow the currency markets, you know that the dollar's been relentlessly strong, been a bit of a problem for economies around the world. It's probably a good bet that if long-term rates have peaked, inflation's peaked, that the dollar's also peaked for this cycle. What gets trickier is the stock market. The stock market put in a big bottom in mid-October. Interestingly enough, on an inflation day like today, when we got a CPI print that was much worse than expected, we made the low for this cycle. We put together a pretty nice rally that has gotten the market up meaningfully from there. Does that low hold going into next year? We have less confidence on that. We're still somewhat defensive with respect to equities. And the big part of the equation that's challenging to solve for is earnings. Typical recession, earnings will contract quite a bit, about a fifth from peak to trough. But this time around, because the slowdown we think will be characterized by modestly negative real growth, but still positive nominal growth, that's not that bad for earnings because, again, we measure earnings in cash flow and nominal dollars, not in real dollars. So still remains somewhat defensive on equities and credit. But we're not particularly concerned that we're going to have a replay of the year that we just had in 2022 with most risk assets going down in price, in some cases 10, 15, 20%. The good news is that is behind us. So those are our forecasts for inflation, growth, and the markets broadly. The big conclusion in terms of forecasting is really a multi-year one, which I mentioned, and that's a return to an environment that we became pretty familiar with. 90s, first half of the 2000s, where inflation moves up and down between, let's say, 2 and 4%. The central banks are active. We pursue conventional monetary policy. We don't have rates at zero. We don't have rates at negative like they were in Europe. And the central banks sort of manage the ebb and flow of the economy, and interest rates normalize That is generally a good thing. The post-financial crisis world was an unusual world. There's a lot of misallocation of capital, and we're seeing some of that misallocation of capital getting unwound, whether it's in aggressive growth stocks, crypto, things of that nature. There's some corrections that are underway in things like private market real estate funds, and that'll continue to unwind as rates normalize. So one of the things that we urge all of our analysts at Neuberger to do is assume that the current interest rate environment prevails for a while. Analyze your companies, analyze your countries on that basis, and do not assume that we're going back to the experience of the post-financial crisis world. It's back to what we describe as the old normal. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're in the bond business, as I am, prospective returns are as good today as they have been since prior to the financial crisis. If you're a saver, things have gotten good again. I think there was a lot of attention paid early post-GFC to the challenges that low to no interest rates provided, both to some institutions like insurance companies, depository institutions, and savers, particularly retirees. So if you're a retiree, and I know my uncle Rick is tuned in from Mequon today, and he's retired. And the good news for Uncle Rick and any retiree is that next year's Social Security check is 8.7% bigger than this year's, courtesy of the inflation adjustment. And money invested in something like a short-term bond fund is yielding about 3 times what it did a year ago. So it's good for insurance companies, it's good for savers, it's good for retired folks. We finally got a real rate of interest back in the short to intermediate term part of the market. And we think that that will continue to prevail. So I'll stop there with my forecast and turn it back to Mike.
Great. Thank you, Brad. That was, you covered the waterfront quite well as usual. So I'm sure we'll have questions for you. Up next is Jon Pevehouse, as I mentioned, the Vilas Distinguished Professor of Political Science right at UW-Madison. His research interests lie in international relations, international political economy, American foreign policy, international organizations, and political methodology. His work examines the relationship between domestic and international politics. He's co-author with Joshua Goldstein of the book International Relations, a leading book in the field. And from 2012 to 2017, he was the editor of International Organization, one of the top journals in the field of international relations. And I have asked Professor Pevehouse to give us some thoughts about what kind of crazy things could happen in this world looking ahead. It's been really, coming out of the pandemic, we've had a pretty tumultuous period of international relations, and probably not unrelated to some of the stress associated with the pandemic. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on what you think lies ahead.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks as always for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here. And I took your assignment. Taking the bull by the horns here, and going to make 8 predictions for you about geopolitics. And when Mike asked me to make predictions, he said, think about Ukraine, Iran, China. It's a lot. So I'm going to do a couple for each of these, and kind of try to give you an explanation of why I think the 2023 is going to be equally tumultuous, if not more, than this year was. Let's start with Russia-Ukraine war, which is something on everyone's mind. Brad mentioned it, obviously, as a source of economic challenges for the global economy, obviously for European economies on the energy front, on the finance front, on the trade front, generally speaking. So here we go. So, and obviously the status of that war is that the Ukrainians have done much better than folks predicted on day one. They've not only resisted Russian incursions, they've pushed Russia back from where initially Russia made territorial gains, pushing into Donetsk just this week. In fact, yesterday, I believe, European allies pledged another $1 billion in aid. The U.S. is going to start providing Patriot missiles to Ukraine to stop some of these Russian air attacks on water and energy systems around places like Kyiv in Ukraine. So here are my 3 predictions for Ukraine, related to Ukraine. Number 1, I think 2023 is going to see major diplomatic initiatives around Ukraine. I think we're going to see high-level diplomatic talks, the likes of which we have not seen since World War II. Like we're talking like 4, 5, 6 heads of state all getting together in some posh resort, including Putin, Zelensky, Biden, Erdogan, Macron, everyone's sitting down to try to figure out how to move this forward. There's a lot of incentives to do so. Russia's obviously not doing well on the ground. Ukraine is doing well, yet Ukraine is now starting to suffer a lot from these Russian air attacks. Europe, as Brad mentioned, is sort of precariously positioned on the energy side as well. The world's precariously positioned on the food supply side, which I'll get back to in my third prediction. So I think you're going to see a lot of very high-level talks in an attempt both to actually try to bring this conflict to some kind of close, but also just to kind of placate growing opposition in a number of countries that not more is being done to try to end the war, as we have potential energy and economic issues still coming out of this war and potentially getting worse. However, those talks will fail, and I think the war will go on for most of the year. One thing that will lead them to fail is my second prediction. I think you'll see a major and significant attack within the borders of Russia. Whether this attack is by Ukraine or this is some kind of false flag operation carried out by Russian forces themselves to try to rally support for the Russian cause domestically, I think you'll see a significant attack within the borders of Russia that is pitched as related to the war. Maybe it will be Ukrainian forces that do this, and what would sort of be I think, an uncharacteristically bad decision for them. Or again, it could be a false flag operation, which will then open up all kinds of debate in the United States and internationally about the course of the war, whether the war is widening, or whether we should quickly return to these peace talks. So I think you'll see an escalation, not just continued attacks by Russia on Ukraine, but sort of some type of attack in Russia, which we haven't seen large-scale versions of, in part because of capability problems of Ukraine, but also because Ukraine is wary about really escalating the war too much and giving Putin a gift, which is why I raised the prospect of the false flag operation. I think third, in bringing in some of Brad's themes here on inflation and so forth, we're sort of on the cusp, and some people would argue we are in the middle of a global food crisis right now, in part pushed by the war in Ukraine. I think that's going to continue. I think the rising energy costs that Brad pointed to will contribute to this global food crisis. We're looking, if you believe forecasters, I know we'll talk about all kinds of different forecasts eventually with Jordan. The weather forecasts for this coming year are for the beginning of an El Nino season, which is going to mean warmer temperatures likely are in most places around the world. And so I think you're more likely to have droughts, which are going to exacerbate climate difficulties that are already seem to be with us. And so we're going to see a major rise, a major issue with global food supplies. And I think that's, we've seen kind of the tip of the iceberg of that. I think that will continue in a really significant way. And will also have long run, not just, implications in terms of starvation, famine, but in terms of the economy as well. Okay, moving on to the Middle East, an equally interesting and relatively unstable place these days. Prediction here, you're going to see Iran continue to move closer to the Russians. In fact, Russia needs Iran, and they need some of their weapons because they can't simply buy enough from North Korea or anyone else who wants to sell them a lot of weapons. MBS, right, Mohammed bin Salman is going to try to intervene in this. And you've already seen some kind of mid-level talks between the Saudis and the Iranians. I think those will expand. I think you're going to see a gambit by the Saudis to really assert themselves as a regional hegemon, to try to keep the lid on their confrontation with Iran, to try to really consolidate their position as sort of the global leader in trying to dictate oil prices, to keep the U.S. at bay, which we've already seen. And so you're going to see a lot of high-level diplomacy again between the Saudis and Iran. What this comes to, I'm not sure. And in fact, one of my other predictions might be about this is that I think this will break down, ironically, over a country like Israel. Right, Saudis simultaneously trying to reach out a little bit of an olive branch to Iran, just a little one. Again, I don't think they're hopeful. I'm not horribly hopeful, but they'll continue. But of course, they've also been doing this quietly with Israel for the last decade, and those may become eventually untenable. And so, and given the instability of the Israeli elections over the last 3 years, hard to know what way that will go too. But my prediction would be, Netanyahu forms a government eventually, and sort of reasserts pressure for more sanctions on Iran, which will make the Saudi-Iran talks more complicated. Other Middle East prediction in Iran, I think these protests that we're seeing in Iran, these protests against the government and the crackdown, especially on the youth of Iran, will continue. I think the crackdown will be successful in the short run. I think by early spring, you'll see these protests start to die out a bit. Again, today, for example, Iranian courts reported that they sentenced 400 young people in Iran to some prison sentence of up to 10 years. I think this, however, by this time next year, they will have reignited. One of the kind of lost themes, one of the lost stories of what's going on in Iran is that this is sort of round 7 of protests in the last 10 years. There are consistent energy economic protests in that country. What's different about this one is it's involving a lot more of the youth, and it's involving a social issue as much as an economic issue. And so protests are not new in Iran. The scale of these is not what we've seen before. And I think the quickness with which Iran and especially the Revolutionary Guard has tried to put these down will be successful in the short run, but I think they will reignite again, either in response to another economic crisis or another social crisis in that country. All right, China, Taiwan. My big bold prediction for China and Taiwan is, unlike what a lot of people are saying, and I've talked about on the show before, there's not going to be a war between China and Taiwan. This is not in either party's interest, certainly not in China's interest right now. Again, Brad mentioned China going through its own economic transition of sorts, also with major demographic problems in China in the medium term. This is just not in their interest whatsoever. They will continue to play this card. They will continue to beat the drum a bit about this. In particular, and when we should be talking about this is this time next year, because there are elections in Taiwan in 2024. So there'll be sort of the constant drumbeat of conflict there, but you're not going to see anything major break out. That's 6th prediction. 7th prediction, I think more internal to China, you're going to see some a Chinese leadership shakeup, which is ironic given that they just finished the 20th Party Congress, where they already were some leadership shakeups, and we believe Xi Jinping sort of continued to stack the Politburo with many of his own supporters. I think you may see, given the recent reversal on zero COVID, I think you may see some changes there, and that will lead American China watchers in particular to muse a lot about where Xi Jinping is going and what his sort of grand strategic plan is for Taiwan, for the economic transition that China is going to have to go through eventually. Finally, I think U.S.-Chinese tensions will reach a sort of a peak pitch at this year, I think in part into the lead up to the 2024 U.S. presidential election. Look, this is one thing that both political parties in this country can agree on, is that they don't like China, that being against China sells in domestic politics in the United States. My really crazy prediction is I think Kevin McCarthy will go to Taiwan if he's eventually makes it as the House Speaker and pulls the Pelosi and goes there just to show, that this is his right, this is the U.S. right to do this, and that we value Taiwan. And I think this will again create a whole set of concerns and potential escalation in that conflict. But again, all of the signs, I think, in U.S. domestic politics point to China being the next sort of big enemy, in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the policy. So and I see no reason why either party leadership is going to back down from this. And so it's only going to make life more difficult vis-a-vis Taiwan, but especially internationally for the U.S. to try to get along with China. And again, you'll see talks, Blinken is there now or going there soon. But I think you're going to see incredible, not necessarily open conflict with China, but you're going to see a tremendous amount of heated diplomacy between the U.S. and China in 2023. And that's it. Those are my 8 predictions.
Wow. Pevehouse and Tank have earned the right to be on the show. That's a lot of predictions from both of you and a lot of detail, and I appreciate how you've done your homework. No wonder you got a PhD. Next up, Eleanor Powell also has a PhD from Harvard, no less. The Booth Fowler Associate Professor of Political Science, and she was an assistant professor of political science at Yale previously. Her book, Where Money Matters in Congress, examines the influence of money on the internal politics of Congress and the biases it has for political policymaking processes. Primarily a Congress scholar, her research revolves around 3 themes: the influence of money, political parties, and the complexities of congressional representation. Her research has appeared in many of the top journals, including the Journal of Politics, British Journal of Political Science, and Political Science Research and Methods, among others. Ellie, thanks for taking time on a Tuesday night, a first-time guest, and your assignment was to give some commentary about U.S. elections in the years ahead and the parties.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here. The last few years in American politics have been filled with uncertainty, norms have been broken, historical precedents have been shattered, so much so that American politics scholars have basically unanimously agreed that we're all out of the prediction business. But it's the end of the year and we're here to do predictions, so we'll do this thing. So I'm here to make predictions in two sort of major areas. I'm going to talk about what to expect in the elections leading up to 2024 and sort of what to expect sort of policy-wise in Washington leading up to those elections. So, of course, the big focus in American politics over the next year is going to be the presidential primaries. Who will both the Democrats and the Republicans nominate? On the Republican side, former President Trump has announced that he's running. The question is sort of, will any other Republicans challenge him? Thus far, no one else has declared. And over the last few years, we've seen time and again, the Republican politicians have been really loath to directly challenge President Trump and seem to believe he has an iron grip on the Republican base. Now, there have been signs lately that things may be changing. Some of his endorsed candidates didn't perform very well in 2022. And obviously, former President Trump is facing an onslaught of legal challenges in a variety of arenas. But of course, the biggest puzzle of American politics over the last several years is that many events that would sort of seem to doom the fate of another politician have not actually impacted former President Trump. So the question is sort of whether or what there's going to be that would sort of break the camel's back in terms of his dominance with Republican base voters. Sort of generalized broadly, Republican primary voters have at all levels have really focused on getting their preferred, sort of often politically extreme candidates elected at the expense of sort of potential electability concerns about which candidates might be most viable in the general election. And so in part, it's going to be a question of whether Republican voters care more about electability and whether their experience in losing some of those 2022 races, and of course, losing the 2020 presidential election is going to encourage them to think more deeply about electability, or whether sort of these ideas about ideological purity and extremism are going to continue to weigh out. I guess I'm not yet convinced that Republican primary voters are going to prioritize electability over extremism that I think we've seen over the last several cycles. So I guess my prediction here is that I think we're going to see other Republicans challenge former President Trump for the Republican nomination, but I think we're going to see a lot of the sort of high-profile likely challengers who are being mentioned right now decline to run, in that they don't want to risk alienating their base Republican voters by challenging him and sort of needing to criticize him to run and win. Instead, they'll sort of wait this one out and wait for an election cycle down the road. But I think there will be some challengers who are going to play the odds that either legal challenges or some other obstacle will eventually sort of break former President Trump's grasp on the Republican base. Now, of course, we also have interesting dynamics on the Democratic presidential primary side. Here, of course, the big question is whether President Biden is going to decide to run for re-election. Now, typically it's almost a foregone conclusion that the president's going to run for re-election. Now, in this case, President Biden's age makes that more of a question. President Biden just turned 80. He's already the oldest president in American politics. And he sort of said he's deciding right now, consulting with his family, sort of what he's going to do. Now, again, this is going to be sort of my hot take here. I think he's not going to run for re-election. I think he's going to decide to sort of bow out, partly due to age concerns, partly also, his numbers in terms of enthusiasm among Democratic base voters actually aren't that high. Democratic voters, in the 2020 election, supported President Biden because they thought he was best positioned to beat President Trump, and that was sort of their sort of big concern in 2016. They may prioritize other things going into 2024. So, I think he's not going to run for a re-election, and I think there's going to be a hotly contested primary on the Democratic side. I'd expect Vice President Harris to get in, but I would imagine a number of other Democrats are going to challenge her for that nomination. And so there's going to be sort of a lot of excitement and intrigue, especially as several of prominent Democrats are in the Biden White House in various cabinet positions. And so how this all shakes out politically is going to be really something to watch moving forward. The other thing that we're going to see, looking up to those 2024 elections, sort of thinking about Congress, both the House and the Senate, thanks to sort of both gerrymandering and population trends, most individual House races and Senate races typically aren't that close. We sort of have a small number of closely contested races. But which party is going to control the major branches of government is very much uncertain due to how closely divided we are as a country. So the presidential election itself is likely to be a toss-up, but so too will be control of the House and the Senate, right? Right now, the Democrats very narrowly control the Senate. The Republicans very narrowly control the House. The next cycle, the 2024, Democrats were up in 2024. There's an unusually large number of them, and an unusually large number of them who represent sort of battleground or even Republican-leaning states. So this is going to be a tough race, a tough cycle for the Democrats politically in the Senate. I'd anticipate they're losing a large number of some seats in the Senate, probably losing control of the seat, unless the Democratic candidate has really large coattails. But if that's something that we haven't seen in recent elections, and so again, I think barring some unusual trend, probably the Republicans pick up control of the Senate, even if a Democrat wins the presidency in 2024. So that's the sort of electoral side. Turning to the sort of policy side, sort of what's going to happen in Washington leading up to 2024. Well, with a Democratic president and a sort of bare Republican majority in the House and a bare Democratic majority in the Senate, it's hard to see much room for sort of passing legislation and sort of policy agreement. It's also unclear whether a potential future Speaker McCarthy is going to be able to hold his caucus together with a very narrow majority and a large number of members who refuse to compromise. So this is going to be a really dicey proposition to sort of get anything through Congress legislatively. Now, major issues are going to come up quickly. If these things aren't solved in the lame duck, things like the budget, the debt ceiling, et cetera, are going to cause major problems and potential for a government shutdown early in the new year. That's going to pose a big challenge, a big difficulty sort of across the board politically. I do think there are some areas in which you're going to see progress and you're going to see things happen. So one area I think we are going to see progress is I think there are going to be a lot of judicial confirmations. Judicial confirmation politics actually do get meaningfully easier for the Democrats right now by picking up one seat, essentially by going from a 50-50 party control with the Vice President Harris casting the tie-breaking vote to a 51-49 Senate actually does make a difference for judicial confirmation, because in a 50-50 Senate, committee seats on the Judiciary Committee are evenly divided, which means it's really difficult for the Democratic nominees to get out of committee, even if they have the votes on the floor of the Senate. But this change, even just one seat, means that the committee numbers are no longer going to be evenly divided, and it should actually speed things up for the Democrats in terms of the judicial confirmation. So I'd anticipate judicial confirmations, and the Democrats really prioritizing that, given essentially that A, nothing else is going to be happening, and B, real stakes that are pretty likely that they're going to lose control of the Senate in 2024. Now, that's the sort of Senate side of where we're going to see progress there. On the House side, Republicans aren't going to be able to pass much legislatively because A, they have this small majority, but B, President Biden would veto. They have to get things through a Democratic Senate. Nothing's much going to happen there. But where we are going to see a lot of action are hearings and investigations. So I'd expect anything and everything that happened under a Biden presidency to be investigated. One sort of particular area of focus is going to be the House Oversight Committee, where more than half the Republican members are in the Freedom Caucus, including notable firebrands Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert. So, I'm predicting lots of hearings, lots of investigation, lots of sort of efforts to get media attention, even if not a lot of sort of legislative action coming out of the House. And then the sort of third area in which I think we could see action politically in Washington leading up to 2024 is, of course, we now have a very strong conservative majority on the Supreme Court, and I would anticipate them continuing to make sort of major conservative rulings overturning longstanding precedents, just like we saw the overturning of Roe versus Wade during the last term. So with that said, I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellie. Those are exciting predictions, and I can see questions rolling in already for you. Next up, we've got Jordan Ellenberg, who is the John D. MacArthur Professor of Mathematics and the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor as well. His field is arithmetic algebraic geometry. His research is partially supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation. He has a Kellett Mid-Career Award at UW and also generous funding from WARF. He's a Discovery Fellow at the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, where he's part of a machine learning group and the Institute for Foundations of Data Science. You probably know him as the author of the books How Not to Be Wrong, The Power of Mathematical Thinking, and Shape, The Hidden Geometry of Information, Biology, Strategy, Democracy, and Everything Else. So, Jordan, you're batting cleanup to tell us about predictions at large, and I think you're going to shed a little bit of light through the lens of COVID and maybe some other things. But take it away, and I'm going to ask Kate Preen to maybe gather up some questions that are coming in so that we've got them bundled, a few for Ellie, a few for Brad, and a few for John, and anything that comes in for Jordan, so that we can get our audience questions answered as best as possible, since we're coming up on 8 here pretty soon. Jordan, take it away.
Yeah, so man, when you write a book called How Not to Be Wrong, the easiest way to accomplish that is not to make any predictions. And I originally told Kate I wasn't going to, but you guys were so great and put yourself out there in so many ways. Let me make one in kind of a different area. Nobody wants to hear my predictions about arithmetic, algebraic geometry. So here's one. I'm going to predict that artificial intelligence is not going to reshape all of our lives in 2023. And in fact, probably not in the next 10 years. And I was thinking of that partially because, look, I'll sort of show this. I was just looking at this amazing book in preparation for doing this. I don't know if you can all see this. The Book of Predictions, a sort of lesser known book by the folks who did the Book of Lists. This was from 1980. And this is an absolutely amazing document. If you look at what people in 1980 were saying about the future, just flipping through it, it was predicted that mind control drugs would widely be distributed in the water by governments in order to corral the populace. I guess depending on what you think about fluoride, maybe you think that one came true. I don't know. In particular, though, just even like looking at the back of the book, like what's on the jacket, what people found interesting. Is it's in 1987, a computer chess champion proved superior to almost all grandmaster chess players. That did happen, but not in 1987. I can tell you that. And in 1989, a computer makes an original scientific discovery and is nominated for a Nobel Prize. That has not happened yet, and certainly did not happen 2 years after computers became really good at chess. So let's just say that people have been predicting the imminent demise of human supremacy at the hands of machines for a long, long time, and it hasn't happened yet. And one basic principle of prediction that I kind of want to get to is that the safest prediction is that things are going to go on as they have been. The safest prediction is always that there's not going to be radical change. Now, of course, sometimes there is, but most things you think might cause radical change, in fact, don't. So if you have to bet, I think that's generally the way to go. So I promised to talk a little bit about COVID, because for folks who are interested in predictions, and especially mathematicians who are interested in predictions, the last few years of trying to understand what this novel virus was going to do as it moved through the population was something everybody was working on. And honestly, I would say our record as a scientific community was not great. Then thinking about how that played out, let me make a metaphor, and then I'm going to close with that. I'm not going to give you a big laundry list of predictions. The metaphor is that predicting things like epidemics, and I would also say things like political activities, economic activities, etc., it's kind of like a game of tennis. So in tennis, if you throw a tennis ball up in the air and whack it, you can actually predict pretty well where it's going to go. Right? If you know, like, with what kind of force the ball was hit by the racket and what kind of spin was imparted to the racket by the ball. Yeah, it's physics, right? Physics is really, really good at predicting the sort of slightly curvilinear path of the ball through space from that. But what physics cannot do is predict who's going to win a tennis match, right? That you don't know. That's much more uncertain. And it's uncertain because it's a fundamentally different kind of problem. It's a problem where short-term things that are predictable, the ball is sort of moving under the sway of physical forces and we know how they behave, it alternates with human intervention, which is much harder to understand. And I think a lot of interesting problems we face, and COVID was certainly one of them, have exactly that nature. There are short-term dynamics, which you can really understand pretty well. If you sort of look at the curves and sort of have all the data you have and want to understand how is this going to look next week relative to this week, actually that worked pretty well. But if you want to know, after this wave dies out, when's the next wave going to come? That has to do not just with with COVID, but with human reaction to COVID. Just as who wins a game of tennis depends not just on physics, but on human reaction to physics. And I think a lot of those sort of large-scale social questions we've talked about have that nature. So I'm going to do a short one and stop there because I would love to hear people's questions.
Terrific. Thank you, Jordan. I agree with your main thesis that usually things kind of go on as they have been going, and that's kind of the secret to economic predictions, I think, barring some kind of weird financial crisis that might be going on in the background or some big disruption. Growth comes in at a fairly predictable level. Stock prices are a little bit more volatile than that, but that's a good rule of thumb. So let's go into our questions, and what I'd like to do, we've got a good list here. I'm going to start with Brad because you were our first speaker. Tim Klain, I haven't seen questions from Uncle Rick. Maybe you take those offline. But Tim Klain wonders, with the raised interest rates that generally take 5 to 6 months to maybe have their full impact on spending, could we be in a recession already?
Sure. Great question. As I said, it's typical. You don't know you're in one until you're in the middle of it, or maybe even after it's over. And the National Bureau of Economic Research calls them after the fact, officially, through the rearview mirror. The indications that we're looking at now, and a couple of the Federal Reserve districts have their own short-term forecasters. The Atlanta Fed is the most well-known, is actually forecasting Q4 GDP to be pretty strong due to some pretty unusual factors. New auto sales are actually running quite strong. Now, a lot of that's catch-up right now. Goods prices are dropping. That was a big factor in today's better than expected inflation print. You actually saw goods prices decline. One of the areas of largest decline was used car prices, which went up a lot during the pandemic because you couldn't get new cars, supply chain interruptions. So there's still a lot of catch-up effects happening in the economy. We all know about the service sector. If you traveled over Thanksgiving, or if you're planning on traveling via air over Christmas, New Year's, the airports are very crowded. Hotels are full. So right now, it seems pretty clear that we are not in one. The forecasters that are forecasting for a recession to happen next year are really kind of gravitating around Q2, Q3, when some of the current momentum begins to dissipate. And as you asked in the question, these lag effects of the full rate hikes really start to feed their way through the economy.
Good answer. We have a question about elections and Twitter. Michael Benninger wonders, what impact will Musk's purchase of Twitter have on future elections? Any thoughts on that, Ellie? I know I didn't ask you to think about Twitter, but obviously
no,
communication.
It's a great question, and part of this depends on sort of what we think the future of Twitter looks like under Musk. There have been such wide-ranging predictions in terms of just like how stable the platform will be, whether the platform is going to continue to be sort of operational and functional in sort of its current form by the time the 2024 elections roll around, whether they end up facing legal challenges, they have budget challenges. So that part is like very uncertain. Now, there's also the sort of policy changes that Musk has been making under Twitter. And it's interesting to sort of think about what ramifications that would have. Now, obviously, very few voters are actually on Twitter. It's a relatively small proportion of people who look at Twitter regularly. Politicians are plugged into it and journalists are plugged into it. Those things matter. One thing I do think it would have an effect on is sort of making it harder for Republicans to avoid or to ignore or to downplay the sort of far right-wing voices that I think have been sort of elevated and sort of getting more attention, getting more traction, been sort of coming back to Twitter since Musk took it over. So, I would imagine, again, it's harder for the Republicans to ignore those folks, but the impact it's going to have, I think, is going to depend on sort of, does Twitter continue to exist on a large scale? And if so, in what form? I think that's really an open question.
And I'd say, as I think the person of the five of us who tweets the most, I think this is a perfect time to use the heuristic that the most likely thing is no radical change. And you saw like very instant predictions of like very rapid dissolution or other sort of like radical changes in Twitter. For the moment, the experience is like roughly the same as it has been. And not that things, I mean, every social network has fallen apart that has existed so far, right? So it could, but I think if you had to bet, I would bet no radical change in the near term, and we'll just see. I hope so, because I like tweeting. I like reading your guys' tweets.
I'm going to stay with you, Jordan. Dennis Mansell wonders, are cryptocurrencies a fraud on the mathematically illiterate?
Maybe
the market illiterate. I don't know.
The math angle, I'm sure this is maybe a little inside baseball, but we're all a little appalled because what's this fellow's name? Bankman-Fried, who just perpetrated this giant fraud, was an alum of like a very popular math summer program when he was in high school that a lot of us went to or have taught out. So we're all like, oh no, not a math camper, like in trouble. So there is like a math angle. I don't know enough to know. I don't even want to, that's not even a prediction, right? It's a question about what cryptocurrency like is right now and not what it could be. So let me put it this way, that it can be used for fraud is definitely clear. That in some ways its design features make it ideal for that use is certainly clear, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what it inherently is.
Fair. Brad Tank, do you have any thoughts about cryptocurrency? I asked you about this last month in person at a reunion.
Yeah, and two of my colleagues, what Mike asked myself and two of my colleagues, all approximately the same age, is how much we had or did have invested in crypto, and we all said this. It's not that we had conclusions about fraud per se. It's just as an alternative to other forms of assets, it remains pretty unproven. And to some extent, the giant growth in interest and ultimately market capitalization that approached $3 trillion across the whole coin universe was unintended consequence of years of easy money. When money's free, and when I talk about a misallocation of capital, a lot of that misallocation went to things that if money were costly, like it is today, it wouldn't have happened. And I think crypto, the large surge in popularity and market capitalization was certainly a feature, a consequence of years of free money.
Good point.
Hey, can I ask the political scientist a question?
Absolutely.
At your hazard.
Okay. So, one thing that both of you spoke to, I think, is, or I think Ellie spoke to it, is that, there are many fewer competitive races in the House of Representatives, like these elections. A lot of them, we sort of know what's going to happen before they happen. Voters are more predictable. We know this, right? Politics is more nationalized. People are making choices about their local and state races much more in line with what national party they belong to than we used to. So I'm just going to come out and say it. I think it would be better if voters were less predictable. And one thing in that direction is ranked choice voting, right? Which has surprised me by being adopted in many more places. I mean, this went along being a weird curiosity that math people were interested in for years and years and years. And now you have it in statewide elections in Maine and Alaska and New York City, which I think is bigger than either Maine or Alaska. Do you think that we'll actually see large scale take up of ranked choice voting or other alternative voting methods? Do you think that'll disrupt some of the painful predictability of our elections? And in particular, do you think it'll help? I mean, Ellie, you talked about parties being sort of held down by their most radical elements. Do you think there will actually be like a move from parties to see it as helping them to get behind these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I too have been shocked by how widely it's been adopted and how quickly, and not just in liberal areas, but in conservative places like Alaska that you mentioned. So the pace of change on this has been really striking. It's always hard to see sort of incumbents who benefit from a system wanting to change that system. And now that we have so many extremists in office, I think it's sort of hard to see them wanting to get rid of this system. And sort of that's where I would anticipate the obstacles coming from. But the leadership in a lot of these states is really frustrated. I mean, we've heard, Senator McConnell talk about sort of candidate selection stuff, and the parties feel like they're losing out for this. So it's certainly possible, but I think there's still going to be some obstacles to just widespread adoption of it.
Jon Pevehouse, I'm going to ask you a question about U.S.-Mexico relations. That's something we didn't cover. It's in the media a little bit because of circumstances at the border, but one consequence of the fraying of globalization as we've known it, which was kind of dominated by China and India's integration into the trading system. Maybe we look to the South and trade more with somewhat lower wage countries in our own hemisphere. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, if you remember way back in the days of the Clinton administration, this was one of the main justifications for NAFTA, and how he convinced a lot of his own party to kind of become free traders all of a sudden and vote for this. Was you were going to, trade was going to increase economic exchange with our neighbors to the South. This would ease immigration pressures, which made both parties happy in the 90s. And so, you may turn back to this, to Brad's earlier point about trade. And I saw, someone asked about trade with China. Month over month trade with China has been going down a bit between the U.S. We're importing less from China. Now it's being made up for by goods from other places, often in Asia. But, we're going to get these things from somewhere. It's still not economically advantageous to make a lot of these goods in the U.S. It's just too expensive. The stat I read from last year was, the U.S. manufacturer still pays more in healthcare subsidies than the wage rate in Mexico. So, it doesn't make sense to make a lot of things here, frankly. And so there's only so much we can do on the manufacturer side in most areas. And so maybe that is the solution. And maybe the USMCA will, try to bring this about. The TPP was certainly meant to kind of do this as well, like sort of carve off some of our friends and create some of these trade corridors and supply chains. But that's a real possibility. And you're right, Mike, it all ties back into the immigration debates very deeply.
Ellie, I'm going to come back to you. If Biden doesn't run, would you expect that someone with a Biden-like agenda, which I would say is a little bit more toward the center of the spectrum of Democratic candidates, at least in the last primary, do you think we'll see someone with Biden-like policies, or will we see someone further to the left of Biden take the primary?
My guess would be someone slightly to the left of Biden. I think Biden, is sort of generationally removed a little bit from who almost all the current crop of candidates who are going to be, who are all, I think, somewhat, at least a touch to the left. But I think there are still some sort of center left younger generation candidates who would be sort of very sort of potentially viable, the sort of, like the Pete Buttigieg type, sort of trying to be sort of a mainstream, get things done kind of candidate. Certainly, I think to the left of Biden, but not sort of as far left as a sort of an AOC or some of these sort of other more prominent liberal Democrats.
Terrific. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour. Is there anything else? I guess Kate wonders, are we focused too much on China these days and Russia? And is there going to be something that might pop elsewhere in the world that will surprise us, Jon? Any conjecture there?
I would say the one. I would say the one thing people haven't paid attention to, it's not on America's radar screen, but the war, which is now in another ceasefire in Ethiopia, has just been a tremendous tragedy, loss of life, famine, and let's hope the ceasefire holds. But interestingly, the UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UN, who's a UW alum, spoke a couple months ago at Madison, and she said this is the biggest world crisis no one's paying attention to. And I think that's right. And it goes into this food shortage issue that I talked about a little bit. Yeah.
Good observation. Well, we are at the top of the hour, everyone. The prediction show was a great success. We got a lot of predictions. I wasn't sure we'd get quite that many.
Did you predict it would be a great success, Mike?
I did predict it. I mean, that's how it wound up being a show. Every show is a prediction by me about what's going to be successful. You're right. But we got our money's worth tonight, a little gold mine, and maybe we'll have a reunion next December and see how it all went. But Jon, especially hats off. I mean, geopolitics. It's hard to make predictions there, and you had a good list for us, and very well thought out, good reasoning. So really, thank you all for being here. It's
pleasure.
always fun to hear from our faculty and alumni. And on Wisconsin, have a great holiday season, all of you. And we will return in the new year with more episodes of UW Now. I think I'm going to have to go on vacation and spend some time cooking up some new ideas. But always a pleasure to be with our alums and our faculty. And great to see everyone. I wish you all a very Merry Christmas and happy holiday, however you choose to celebrate it, and a happy new year and a healthy new year ahead. On Wisconsin.
Welcome to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, purveyor of Midwestern values. Values like a hard day's work, lending a helping hand, being a friendly neighbor, spending time with family, staying close to home, enjoying the simpler things in life, and living with integrity. It's these values that make a Badger unstoppable.